So we're going to do chapter 24 very, very quickly. So we're just going to talk through all of the different important things from chapter 24. So the purpose of chapter 24 is to talk about how all these differences, how the mechanisms of natural selection and how differences between populations from generation to generation actually lead to new species, right? Because Darwin saw in the Galapagos, he saw a bunch of different species, and so now we're actually figuring out how those species evolved. How did it become a different species from what the ancestor? So an important word here is speciation, and that is the origin of a new species. Ation meaning making, species meaning species. We can look at this at two different levels. We can look at microevolution, which is what we've kind of been doing more, which is changing of allele frequency over time. So that's all of chapter 23, Hardy Weinberg, everything like that, looking from generation to generation, seeing how allelic frequencies change. And macroevolution is looking big picture. So how do species evolve in relationship to each other? How's one species change over millions of generations instead of just a couple? All of those things. Macro meaning small scale, alleles from generation to generation. Macro meaning really big scale, how multiple species affect each other's evolution, how it'll change over millions of years. Okay, so the first section is about the biological species concept, and this means that it's hard to define what a species is. And there have been a bunch of different attempts to really define what a species is, and none of them are perfect, but the one that's most frequently relied on, and probably one that you're familiar with, is the fact that is the biological species concept, which means that a species is a member of a population that can mate and reproduce only with themselves. So members of different species are not going to mate, and they're not going to, or if they do, they're not going to be successful. So they don't breed successfully with other populations. And so it's important that there's gene flow between different populations of the same species to ensure that they don't become different species. So if there's a group of rabbits living in Gardena and a group of rabbits living in El Segundo, they are still going to have some gene flow somehow. That way, that group of rabbits doesn't become a different species from this species. Here's a bunch of pictures of people. Okay. So the reason for this biological species concept, if they're not going to breed together, why? That's the question that is answered by this, and that's because they're reproductively isolated. So they're separated from each other via reproduction. And there's a bunch, so that's why they're different species, because they will not reproduce with each other. And sometimes we do get them reproducing together, and we get something called a hybrid. And that's sometimes how new species form, and that's sometimes a dead end. So we're going to talk about both those things. And when it comes to reproductive isolation, it can happen before fertilization, so before the sperm meets the egg from two different species, or after the sperm meets the egg, so pre or post fertilization. And here's all of them. So these are the pre-zygotic mechanisms that prevent reproduction between two different species. So if any one of these things happen, or any one of these in particular might be the reason why two species are not reproducing together. So one of them is habitat isolation. So this snake lives in water, this snake lives on the ground. They're never going to come into contact with each other. They're not going to reproduce. It's simple as that. There's never going to be the possibility for a mate because they don't see each other, right? That's as simple as that. That's habitat isolation. Then there's temporal isolation. That looks like a species of skunk. And one of those species of skunks might mate in the winter, and another one mates in the spring. So they're never going to have a chance to reproduce together because they won't be fertile at the same time as each other. So temporal isolation. They're just never going to mate at the same time, so it won't work. Then there's behavioral isolation. This happens when two different species don't have the same mating behaviors as the other. So that would be like these blue-fitted boobies here have a courtship dance, and that means that one species doesn't recognize the other's courtship dance. So they're not going to be ready for reproduction because they are not going to recognize the courtship dance. Same thing as like mating calls with birds and stuff like that. If you don't recognize them, you're not going to mate with them. So that would be a behavioral isolation. So they are behaviorally isolated from each other. So those three things occur before a mating attempt, okay? So they are going to prevent any mating attempt from happening. Now let's say that none of those happen. So they're not in different spaces, they don't mate at different times, and they don't have different reproductive behaviors. They may try to mate. And what one possibility of what could happen would be mechanical isolation. So that means that they just actually can't mate together. For example, these are two different species of snails, and their genital openings cannot align with each other. So no matter if they really, really wanted to reproduce, they couldn't make it happen. Their genitalia does not match each other. Think of this, maybe you don't want to, but think of this kind of like a rabbit trying to mate with a bull. It's not really going to happen. That right there would be mechanical isolation. It's physically not going to happen. Then there's gametic isolation, which is when, okay, maybe the mating attempt happens, the sperm is able to reach the egg, but the sperm and the egg don't fuse. For whatever reason, they are not compatible, and no zygote is ever formed because the sperm doesn't enter the egg. Okay, so those are all of the things that happen before a zygote is formed. So they could be in different places, they could be at different times, they could not recognize each other's mating behaviors, or if they do actually mate, they might physically not be able to get sperm to egg, or they may get sperm to egg, but the sperm and the egg don't match, and they can't fuse to make a gamete. So then let's say that none of those things happen, and the sperm does meet the egg. Then there's three possibilities for this life that was just made in the zygote. The first one is reduced hybrid viability. So this means that they're going to make a hybrid. Remember, it's a cross between two different species, but the gene combinations are just going to make this guy not likely to survive. This is a salamander, and they never live to adulthood, okay, because they're made from two different species and their genes just don't support success reproductively. Then, if that's not the case, they may have reduced hybrid fertility, which means that they are going to be fine, they'll be fine and healthy and they'll live a long time, but they're not fertile. So their reproductive fitness is zero because they can never have offspring. This is the example of when a female donkey and a male horse, or I'm sorry, a male donkey and a female horse mate, they get a mule. And a mule is a real thing, but it's not reproductively fertile. So there's never been a baby mule born from a mule ever. They never can have babies. So it's not its own species because they can't mate with each other, right? So that's why mules and horses, that's why donkeys and horses are two different species because their offspring cannot reproduce. Then we have hybrid breakdown, which is then, so maybe the hybrid offspring from two different species lives and reproduces. Maybe that, like, they're so close together that might actually happen, but then the next generation will see problems where they won't be able to reproduce. So it's not a viable lineage because generation after generation, they're not going to become their own species. So those are the two different big pictures, prezygotic, before a zygote is formed, and postzygotic reproduction, reproductive isolation. All right, here's all these things. You can read about those. Okay, so very quickly, some reasons why the biological species concept are not accepted is because it doesn't apply to everything. We can't apply it to ancient species. We can never know if they're different species because we can't make them reproduce. And asexually reproducing organisms, like all prokaryotes and a lot of eukaryotic plants or animals and anything like that, they don't reproduce sexually, so there's no way to distinguish in that case. So those are some limitations of the concept. Then there's a couple others, such as morphological species concept, ecological species concept, and phylogenetic species concept. Look over those, but just know that biological species concept is the main accepted one, although it is not 100%. All right, so now we're going to talk about how these species actually happen, how speciation happens. It can happen in two ways. It can happen allopatrically or sympatrically. Allopatric speciation is when there is a genetic or a physical blocker between the two species. So here's a pool of orange fish, then for whatever reason, these two fish are separated because there's low tide that year. So these guys keep evolving and having allelic frequency changes generation after generation. Same thing with these guys. Suddenly, they stop reproducing together because they're spatially separated. Okay, this would be an example of spatial separation, spatial isolation. So now enough allelic frequencies differences have accumulated that they're two different species. So that's allopatric speciation. When a new species, or when two species become two separate species, when one species becomes two separate species because of a physical barrier. Then sympatric speciation is when there's no physical barrier, they're still around to breed with each other, but for whatever reason, they have evolved into two groups that start accumulating allelic differences, allelic frequency differences, and become two of their own species. This happens a lot with plants because plants can have multiple chromosome numbers. So, well, let's talk about allopatric speciation. These two little guys were separated by the Grand Canyon, so now they're two different species. There's an example. Guppies, okay. Yikes. Okay, sympatric speciation. New speciation while they're living together. This happens a lot in plants because plants can have crazy number of chromosomes and still be fine. And so if you have a meiotic error, suddenly you have a plant that its 2N number is 10 that came from a plant that was 2N6 and 2N4, and now they have all these guys and you have a new species. Okay, so that would be sympatric speciation. Look over this, a review between allopatric and sympatric speciation. We're skipping 24.3 and getting on to 24.4. Okay, I skipped it. Okay, so this talks about rates of speciation. So sometimes speciation happens super rapidly, or sometimes it happens really, really, really slowly and takes bajillions of years. It's a scientific term, bajillions. So we can study this using the fossil record because we have so much evidence from of different species from so long. So we see a couple different patterns in the fossil record. The first one is called punctuated equilibrium, and this means that the example of this is that speciation doesn't happen like very, 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 very slowly over thousands, millions of years. What happens is there's one speciation event. So here's the ancestor. There's one speciation event, and it happens very quickly, and suddenly we have two different species. Then the two species stay the same for a very, 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 very long time until suddenly there's another speciation event, and they may differ again. Okay, so that would be punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated meaning interrupted or marked off. So it's equilibrium. It's not changing. It's a period of stasis, staying the same, until suddenly there's something that interrupts it. It's punctuated, which is the way a period interrupts multiple sentences, and suddenly evolution happens. Speciation happens very, very quickly, whether it's in regards to a predator being introduced, or a predator being removed, or a natural disaster. Something's changing in their environment, and evolution happens so fast, there's suddenly speciation occurred and they're a new species, but then they're not going to change for thousands of years. So that would be punctuated equilibrium. The other example is a gradualism, or a gradual example. And this is kind of what you would think. We have one parent species, one common ancestor, and very slowly, with lots of little changes, they become two different species. So those are in contrast to each other. There's gradualism, which is kind of no big events, just generation after generation. We accumulate lots of tiny little changes, and we start off little differences, and then they get a little bigger, then a little bigger, then a little bigger, and then they're their own species. This is different than punctuated equilibrium, which means we have periods of stasis, staying the same. Boom. Evolution, speciation happens, and then they stay the same again. And we can see that different species evolve with each other. So read about this in your textbook. And that's all for chapter 24.